Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Sex Matters webinar. I'm Helen Joyce, the Director of Advocacy for Sex Matters. And tonight I'm talking to two of the women who are doing most to protect the women's category against pressure to open it up to men. And those two women are Olympian Sharron Davies and Fair Play for Women's Fiona McAnena. So Sharron made her Olympic debut in 1976 at the tender age of 13. And 4 years later, she took a silver medal at the Moscow Olympics, finishing just behind Petra Schneider of East Germany, who has since admitted that her performance was heavily drug-enhanced. And the impetus for holding this webinar comes from the publication of Sharron's latest book, Unfair Play, The Battle for Women's Sport. And that was written with Times sports journalist Craig Lord, and it came out just a few days ago. And I was lucky enough to get a copy very shortly before it came out, and it's absolutely brilliant. So I can read you out some of the endorsements here. Notions of fair play and a level playing field are the reason sport has lasted thousands of years. If we take those away, we will also abandon 52% of the world's population, and that's from Daley Thompson, who has been friends with Sharron since their early sporting career. It's great to see a female athlete supporting those who follow in her footsteps. That's Martina Navratilova. And Nancy Hogshead-Macker, I'm sure I'm not saying that right, another Olympic gold medalist, she says that the story was tackled with precision and fairness. And I particularly liked Melanie Reid of the Times, who said it was a passionate book, one with a mission, that it was hard-hitting, important, scientifically rigorous, polemic, thrillingly fearless. So I really recommend it to anyone who wants a book that they can give to people who are still saying that this is a niche issue or unimportant or being unfairly exploited to stoke a culture war. And our other panellist, Fiona McAnena, is one of the two women alongside Dr. Nick Williams who have made Fair Play for Women so influential in sports regulation. So for several years now, Nick and Fiona have been meeting with literally dozens and dozens of sporting bodies and regulators, pressing them to listen to the evidence regarding the male sporting advantage and to the voices of female athletes who overwhelmingly want to keep the women's category for women. So the way tonight's going to run is this. I'm going to start with a one-on-one interview with Sharron, and we'll focus on the book mostly, her motivation for writing it, what she sees ahead for the female category in sport. And then I'll turn to Fiona and ask for her insights into what's happening within sports regulation, because there's been a lot of movement, and I suspect that she'll be able to share more with us from behind the scenes. And then we'll wrap up with a three-way conversation. So thanks to everyone who submitted questions in advance. I have used those to prepare my own questions, but if you have more during the discussion, you can put them in the Zoom Q&A, and I will try to get to as many as I can. We'll be finishing at 8:30, and the recording will then be available on our YouTube channel shortly afterwards. All right, Sharron, I was so excited to get this book. I really was, because obviously I've written a book on similar topics myself, indeed, for which I interviewed you for. And I thought, as I was reading it, like 2 pages in, I thought, wow, this is the book that's managed to get the tone that all of us are trying to get, which is that you are enraged, but you keep that tamped down and you just talk about evidence. Talk to me a bit about those decisions about tone and content and whether it was difficult to get it over the line and so on.
Yeah, evening everybody. It was something that I desperately wanted to put as a sort of form of reference, for everybody, for all those people out there running clubs and teachers and people that want to have the evidence to be able to use to try and preserve the female category. And a lot of them are being scared through either kind of gotchas that come from trans activists or just a lack of knowledge, or they genuinely, feel that they're being kind, but they don't realize that the damage that they're actually doing. And it is a hard process, you've written a book. It's so much harder than you think it's going to be. And the whole thing really probably took about a year, and it's going backwards and forwards. Craig is writing stuff. I'm, editing all of it, changing it, telling him I want more of this. Then I'm fighting with the publishers because I want this in, and they're going, no, you can't have that. Then it ends up with a legal read. And, there's a huge process. And also trying to explain why I'm so passionate, which comes a lot from my own personal history of racing the East Germans during that era, when we know categorically now, but we knew at the time because, they would come from nowhere. They had big Adam's apples, they had a male physique, they had a very deep voice, they had very bad skin, and they would totally dominate the women's events and do practically nothing in the men's events. So it wasn't as if we then, oh, what a surprise, they're all taking drugs. We knew, we just didn't know how to catch them. And we were unbelievably frustrated with the IOC and the swimming federations for doing so little for so long. That was 20 years. So I won my medal, which enabled me to have the career that I have. But I have friends that didn't win any medals, and were beaten by East Germans into fourth place. And their whole lives would have been totally and utterly different had they had the accolades that they deserved. And I just could not sit back and watch it happen all over again. And my dad spoke out at the time and was never picked as an international coach because he said they're cheating, do something. And so it was that embarrassment again about calling out the obvious, and he was punished for it. And exactly the same thing is happening now. And it's the same end result, this false puberty that these young girls were put through. They were put through male puberty by giving them testosterone from as young as 11, which is horrendous, obviously with huge horrendous side effects. And now we've got males that have gone through puberty, which gives an even bigger advantage. And then it's an even worse situation because it's across so many sports and it's across every single age group. Whereas when it was the East Germans, it was really just elite sport in swimming, track and field, and probably rowing. And it was only at major internationals. It didn't go anywhere else, and now we've got it going through grassroots. We've got PC teachers having co-ed sports days in primary schools where little girls get to win nothing. We've got masters events, we've got course records on park run. I mean, it's just everywhere at the moment and affecting so many women. And it's never been backed up with any science ever. And that was what I could never get my head around, that here we were all these years later and the IOC were doing exactly the same thing all over again, just totally and utterly betraying female athletes.
So let's pick up on that one. And the book doesn't pull punches on your opinions on the IOC, and you do use the word cheating. No. And you criticise them for not just allowing men to compete in women's sports, for cozying up to corrupt regimes, for their long and inglorious history of being on the power and money side of sport, and you name names. In places, actually, I thought as I was reading it read like a whodunit, actually.
A lot of the work was in the reffing as well. That's what took so much time, because everything had to be studiously referenced, and so that legally we couldn't have any problems. And so it was. And everything you read in that book is 100% factual and 100% true. Whether it's talking about corruption, how much money they get paid as volunteers, which is huge amounts. So they're certainly not volunteers, and or the way that they make decisions, or the corruption that's been going on in pretty much every single country that's held the Olympics for goodness knows how long. Even to the point that just this week we've had raids on the French Olympic establishment in Paris. It doesn't change. It doesn't change, and until we get some sort of FIFA investigation which turns them all out and turfs all the bad ones out and starts all over again, I'm not sure that they're going to change.
Can you take us back to the moment when you realised that the sporting authorities just didn't care about female athletes and female sport the way that they care about male athletes and male sports?
I think that was kind of what was happening all the way through the 70s and the 80s. We didn't have a single female board member on anything, whether that was a swimming federation board, whether that was the IOC board. In Moscow, where I won my medal, there were 4 males to every single female. It wasn't the way that we were treated in the UK. And I've always felt that with swimming, we didn't have too much inequality in the way that the coaches were with us, or the way that the country, selected us, or any of those things, because obviously we are all racing together. There's a men's race and then there's a women's race. It's a little bit different, I think, with things like football and cricket and golf, where they're very, very separate from the men's teams. We were always training with the guys, and we'd always go away with the guys, and we'd all race together on the same day. So I always felt that there was great equality with that. It was more that we were just not given the same kind of respect that men's sport was given by the people that ran it. And I still feel in lots of cases it's not just the women, it's actually all of the athletes. It's that they just don't centre the athletes. The IOC don't centre the athletes, the IOC centre themselves and the IOC committee, and whether they're getting the best hotel with the biggest expense account, with the most amount of, private cars and all of that. And that's why we constantly are going to the places that we're going to all of the times. I mean, something like, we haven't had a major swimming event in North America, in Canada or America in particular, obviously as the number one swimming state, for something like 30 years. Because the Americans will just not spend the money on bureaucrats to put them up in the fashion that they want to be put up in.
Now, you're somebody who has gone through sex testing, which is now routinely described as the most humiliating, invasive, horrific human rights abuse. Tell us what happens. What is sex testing?
It's just so ridiculous to say that, honestly. I had a sex test and you only have one. You have one in your life, because believe it or not, you cannot change your sex, okay? So this is a tiny little cotton swab, the sort of thing that you normally clean your ears with. Wipe it on the inside of your mouth. The whole thing takes less than 10 seconds. And that is it. And believe me, if you have a problem with that, there's no way you should be anywhere near elite sport, because they stand there and watch you pee for all your drug tests, which is way more intrusive. So it's a ridiculous statement to say that, a sex test is intrusive in any shape or form or not. It's not, in the absolute slightest. And as said, it's once in a lifetime. So once you've got your little card, which I've got in my drawer over there, telling me that I'm a female, then that's it, and I don't understand why we can't go back to that. And again, this is another area where the IOC were just outrageous. They polled their female athletes, and something like 94% said, absolutely no problem, we love it, don't worry about it, yes, please carry on. And there was 4% that said that they were made slightly anxious by it, so they stopped it.
Oh my God.
And you're like,
yeah.
The over 90% of women said, please carry on with sex tests. We're very happy with it. And it all kind of disappeared, and we got ourselves into deep water really from that point, I think. And I would personally love to see that come back. I think there's no reason why we can't have a sex test, and why we can't have a ring fence a female category, and then come up with this open, inclusive category where everybody is welcome. We obviously need somewhere for transgender men to compete that are on testosterone. They're never talked about. They're totally ignored because, of course, they're female and they don't matter. And they're not going to, have any impression on the men in any shape or form. And it would give somewhere, obviously, for transgender women to compete. And then they could decide how much they do or don't want to suppress their testosterone. What a lot of people don't also realise, with all these ridiculous levels of, testosterone, 10 nanomoles for a year, 5 nanomoles for 2.5, there is no testing system in place. There's no independent testing system for that program in place anywhere in the world. This is a self-reported with your own doctor program, when we know that we can reduce testosterone extremely quickly if we choose to. And also, if I was to get caught taking testosterone, I would receive a 4-year ban. If a transgender woman is caught with testosterone above the level they're supposed to have, they would receive a 1-year ban.
Right.
Because, of course, they made a mistake and I'm a cheat.
Yeah.
Again, so there's so many anomalies which are just ridiculous and unfair and not the same, across everybody in the category. It just makes no sense in any direction whatsoever.
I think we may have reached the point in the scandal of transgender inclusion, as in male inclusion in female sport, where people are starting to ask, how is this going to end and how will it be remembered? And one of the things that's interesting about sport compared with other areas is we do have a precedent. So can you talk a bit about what you say in the book and what you discovered about whether there was any reckoning, any justice, whether any guilty people ever accepted what they had done, or whether it just sailed on?
What with the East German era?
Yes, sorry, exactly.
Yeah. So this went on for 20 years. They absolutely dominated to the point where East German women won 92% of all the European medals during that period of time. In my 1, 2, 3 full podiums, bearing in mind they took none in the men, so it was just total and utter dominance in track and field, in rowing and in swimming. That was where they concentrated all their efforts, because what they'd worked out was that by giving testosterone to young girls, they could put them through basically a male puberty, and then they would have about a 9% advantage. If you took 9% away from Petra Schneider, who beat me by 10 seconds, she would have been 16 seconds behind me. And 9% is less than the lowest figure that we have at the Olympic Games of the difference between male and female. That's around 10%. And the top range is about 30% being, weightlifting. So the more explosive a sport is, the more it is an advantage to have gone through male puberty. And nothing has ever been done about that. We still have all their records in the record books. We still have all of their positions. They still have all their medals. They still sit in the halls of fame. And in fact, Petra Schneider still holds the unified German record to this day. And she would have been on the podium for 40 years after that time. It's just ludicrous. And I suppose it was very hard for my dad, because my dad was my coach, and he just, as a father, he couldn't fix it for me, and what it's like. We know what it's like as parents. You want to do the best thing you can by your child, and and he was there every morning at 5 o'clock. He made such huge sacrifices to coach me. My whole family made massive sacrifices, because there was no lottery in those days. We didn't have a holiday from when I was about 10, because all that money was being spent on me. None of my parents never came to watch me compete because they couldn't afford it, apart from the very first Olympic Games, when the city of Plymouth put together a fund and sent them. And then the last Olympics, where my dad went by himself. And on the night I won my medal, I remember him staying behind to see me after my drugs test. And he'd missed the last bus, and of course it was Russia, so everything had to be, if you missed the bus, there was no other bus, and no taxis or anything, and he had to walk 8 miles back to his hotel. It was a very strange Olympics. I mean, I've done 12, and they're all fabulous, but they're all very, very different. And without a shadow of doubt, London was the best, of course. I'm very biased, but fantastic. But each one has a real character. And London was amazing. Sydney was the first Green Olympic Games. Athens, it was the celebration of 100 years, so it felt like the right place to be. Beijing was very, very technical and bells and whistles, but behind the scenes, it was a little bit of a sort of a stir. And then Rio was a total bedlam. I mean, Rio looked amazing because we had this beautiful location, but it was bedlam behind the scenes. I'm surprised it ever actually happened.
I lived in Brazil in the
run-up. I'm so privileged to be there.
I was also surprised it happened, and I was a Brazil correspondent in the run-up to it. You met Petra Schneider and talked to her about it, didn't you? I mean, I think you said how sorry you feel for the East German women. You don't feel that they were the thieves. Yes. It was their coaches and the system that were the thieves. And they've suffered really horrendous knock-on impact.
They have. I mean, the drugs that they were given were horrendous, and there was no thought to what the side effects would be. And I thought I knew quite a lot. Craig has real insight into this as well, because Craig's wife is an ex-East German swimmer, but she was one of those swimmers who was kind of used as a guinea pig to work out the dosage, to work out what was successful, what wasn't successful. And of course, when you can take a very average swimmer and improve them by 9%, that makes them a world champion literally overnight. So they had numerous average swimmers that they could experiment on. So he has massive insight. And one of the things that really shocked me, and I kind of knew, but I didn't quite realize it was as bad as this, that on the training camp for all the East German athletes, they actually had an abortion clinic, because when they were giving testosterone to these young girls, it would obviously massively increase their sex drive. And it was very much inferred that it wasn't the other male swimmers that were getting them pregnant. It was staff, it was coaches, it was Stasi. It was a sort of the authoritarian people that were supposed to be looking after them. And of course, they weren't going to allow them to give birth, because it meant that they lost a possible unique and perfect athlete that was going to win the medals. But secondly, they didn't know what actually would happen. So they just performed routine abortions in a clinic, in the training facility, because they didn't want it to go to the local hospital in case that information got out, which I just think is just harrowing. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And they were total and utter victims of men. Again, I mean, the book explains that the Stasi and East Germany was run by men. And it was just men using women to, as a form of propaganda for them to be able to win medals and say, look at us, aren't we clever?
So the question I guess everyone asks you, and I guess it's a sort of an irritating question, but I am also interested in your answer, which is, have you ever regretted coming back to this fight? I mean, you already put yourself through it on the East German scandal, and now here you are again being called controversial, etc., etc. Do you sometimes wish that you'd left it to other people?
No, because I think the reason I am outspoken is because of the East German situation. We didn't get anywhere speaking out with the East German situation, and I was just absolutely damned if I was going to let it happen again to another generation of young females, that they were going to end up with a decade's worth of losing their opportunities, their medals, their prizes, their podiums, their opportunity to put their success on their CV, to help them to get jobs, and all the other things that sporting prowess does for you. And I just thought, no, I can't stay quiet. And I suppose I was lucky in a way that, I've had 40 years of a very good earning capacity, and I've mostly paid for my house. I didn't expect it to be as bad as it was. I didn't expect people that I'd worked with for 25 years to literally just cold shoulder me from charities that I'd given, years of my time to support and help raise profiles and money and all sorts of things. And when all I was asking was that we look at the science. That's literally all I ever asked for from the word go, was please, let's look at the science and let's work with the science before we just kick women's sports to the PC, curb, which is what was done. And it was done again by men who were trying to placate the activists, the trans activists, and women's sport just didn't matter enough for them to not fight for it properly. It's just extraordinary. And I'm disappointed in the few women that are in positions of authority that aren't standing up. But unfortunately, we have a system where those women are also on the IOC treadmill or the NGOB treadmill, where they're not going to rock the boat because they want to be promoted. They want to be promoted into positions of authority that pays well, that sends them all over the world. And if they speak out, that they're not going to be promoted.
Well, Sharron, I think we've made immense progress in the last few years, and that has been, there have been several people who've been pulling, but you certainly are up there at the absolute top. What I'm going to do now is bring in Fiona, and then we'll come back to a three-way, and we'll include questions from our viewers into that. Fiona, perhaps we could just start with a little recap of the history of how we got to the point that there were males allowed to compete on, fairly flimsy or loose conditions in women's sports. Just a sort of 2-minute recap for people who don't know how it happened.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things happened in parallel. So the IOC basically, sat around and was persuaded by some men that it was a human right for transsexuals, as they were then called, to be able to access elite sport. And this is 20 years ago. Emma Hilton did a great talk on this, actually, which you can find on our website from the 2019 sport event that we did with Women's Place. And she explains that whole track. But what happened in the UK was entirely different. In the UK, the Sports Council's Equality Group commissioned a sort of, diversity and inclusion person about 10 years ago to say, what do we do about transgender people in sport? And she went off and just talked to trans groups. And so they basically wrote the guidance that they wanted, which was, well, obviously we have to be allowed to identify in the gender we feel we are, and we have to be allowed to use the facilities where we belong. And, there won't be too many of us, it'll be fine. And this idea of testosterone suppression came in the UK, as I say, that long ago, 10 years ago. The IOC then adopted it as well a little bit later. So by the middle of, by 2015, just about everybody, all the international federations, pretty much, with the exception of boxing, and all the UK federations, pretty much, UK governing bodies, they were all saying, yeah, a trans person, they go through a lot, their life is difficult, they're really committed to their trans identity. So if they suppress their testosterone, or in some cases, if they just declare that they really do feel like the other sex, they should be allowed to play sport. And we have something like 120 different governing bodies across the UK. So you've got about 60 sports, and then some of them are UK and some of them have separate home nations. So you've got a lot of different groups. They all just fell into line. They all just said, yeah, we need to provide for these people. And the big mistake they made was they centered the entire discussion on what trans people wanted and needed. And they completely either overlooked or didn't care that what they were really doing was changing who was eligible for the female category at every level, from teenage girls all the way up to elite sport. They were saying, yeah, women need their own category, but we can let some male people in because they feel like it. So when we started to try and challenge that about 5 years ago, governing bodies just pointed to the Sports Council's guidance and said, well, we're just doing what they told us to do. So it was very hard to get traction for the first couple of years.
So you've, I think by now you and Nick have spoken to maybe 40 or 50 different sports bodies. And I know I interviewed Nick also for my book, as well as Sharron, and she said that the first difficulty is getting into the room, and the second difficulty is being able to use language that allows you to express what you're trying to do. So explain a bit about that, but also has that changed over the 5 or so years you've been doing this?
Yeah, so about 4 years ago, Nick managed, by leaning on contacts, to get to a big meeting that World Athletics hosted in Lausanne, where they invited a bunch of other world federations to try and review what should be done. And Nick was really the only person there who was advocating for women. Of course, Joanna Harper was there, Joanna Harper, who has the very poor piece of research that basically said when Joanna transitioned, Joanna got slower, ergo testosterone suppression is enough. But when Nick tried to say, the issue we're talking about here is it's not about people's trans identities. We don't mind how people identify. It's about male bodies in female sport. Everybody sort of gasped in horror and said, you can't say that. And we've had that happen a lot of times. World Rugby had a big workshop on this 3 years ago, and they were, one of the first international federations to fix the female category to protect women and girls. But the same thing happened when they had their workshop. and the trans activists in particular, had a fit of the vapors and said, you can't say those things. We keep on saying it. I mean, that's the thing. Anytime I speak to a federation, I have to do a whole preface of how we believe sport should be inclusive of everyone and, blah, 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 which I do believe. But I'm also pretty sure that the other side don't have to advocate for women. I mean, we're almost at times advocating for trans people with trans identities as well as for women, because we have to do that in order to say, but the female category is there for female bodies. It's nothing to do with identity. Helen, we've just kind of kept going, and we keep talking about that. And we keep a couple of things, recentering the conversation on the female people and the female category, and that's who we're here to advocate for. And there are other groups who advocate for people with trans identities, and you should talk to them too. I always say to the governing bodies, of course you should talk to them too. I'm here to advocate for women and girls, make sure that we have opportunities for fair sport. That's what I'm here to do. And secondly, because of that, our beef is not trans or trans identities. Our beef is that the female category has to be for the female people. And there is no way to turn a male body or remove all the advantage that a male body has in sport. And so, end of story. And I think they're getting used to that now. And in fact, we know that these governing bodies talk to each other. Lots of them have there's a CEO WhatsApp group for the UK and England governing bodies, and there's one for all the water sports and one for the combat groups and all that. So we hear, that this is still a really hot issue for them, but also that they're now saying, actually, it's okay to talk to those people. You can talk to those women's groups. Whereas 4 years ago, they thought that they couldn't talk to us.
I think you know this, Fiona, but I recorded an entire programme with Trevor Phillips on Sky TV with Joanna Harper. And the first thing that happened was I just said, female and male bodies are different. And Joanna Harper objected to the use of the words female and male. And I don't know if Joanna later complained or what, but anyway, that programme got canned and never got broadcast. So I can't think of any reason to object to it other than me saying that male and female are real categories. Anyway, so you think you're making progress in getting into the room in using reality-based language, but we've also actually seen some real movement on regulation. So I think that's really over the last 6 months to a year, certain sports have moved. So talk a little bit to us about that.
So when we first started lobbying governing bodies, they really weren't much interested in what we had to say. They were driven by what the Sports Council said. And Sharon was involved with Nicola Williams in going to see Sport England and going to see UK Sport and really trying to say to them, look, you have an issue here. You think this is all neatly tied up, your trans inclusion guidance, but it's a problem. And so eventually, and it wasn't just pressure from us, it was pressure from other people and governing bodies also saying, we've got a bit of a problem here. The issue started to become a problem. There started to be more males who wanted into female sport. And so the sports councils did new guidance. So that's been a turning point in the UK. That guidance took 18 months to come out. It was very political. It sits on the fence in some ways. But the conclusion is that this idea of balancing trans inclusion with fairness for females doesn't exist. There's no balancing. And it says that really clearly. It says to sports bodies, you have to choose. And so that's almost 2 years ago that came out. And when that came out, we then launched a big campaign where we just went after every governing body we could. We've emailed some of them, probably 15 times. Sometimes you still get a meeting on the 15th email to say, we need to rethink this. And I've had some very surprising reactions. There are a few who say it's not a problem in my sport. I don't need to bother. There are some who say, I'm not going to talk to you. I don't share your values. But the majority say, oh, yeah, you've got a point. Oh, yeah, I didn't see it like that. I mean, it's really shocking. And it's not the case that it's all men at national level. It's not the case that it's all men who don't think about it. It's also women who think that it's up to them really to be kind. I've had people on governing body boards say to me, men say to me, it was really hard for me to argue to change the policy when the women on the board were saying, oh, that's okay. There aren't very many. We can let them in. We can be kind. So, the socialization of women to be accommodating is being taken advantage of. But women are also in some cases doing it too. So there's a lot of factors really to try and unpick in order to push back against the somewhat thoughtless policies that were changed so fast. And here we are 2 years on, and a lot of these governing bodies are still just thinking about it. It's not as quick to change back. They're an awful lot more cautious now than they were back then.
So I can see that we're converging on a solution, at least in non-contact sports, which is the one that John Pike and others have advocated for, which is that you have a closed female category, really only for female people who were born female and who have not taken testosterone, and then an open category for everybody else. But the policies that we've seen like that so far, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, seem to say that's for elite sports and that we can have self-ID at a more junior level or in participation or for children or whatever. What do you think of that? Would that be good enough if we just protect the elite level?
No, absolutely not. And once we started to win the argument that testosterone suppression didn't work and you had to restore fairness, then what we saw was people trying to argue for compromise. You see, they've got themselves in this mess where they've given away women's sport at every level to trans activists, and now they're afraid to take it all back. So no, we're very clear that we're not grateful for fairness to be restored for that 0.01% of women who do elite sport. 99.99% of women's sport is not elite. It's juniors, it's masters, it's, all kinds of levels. One of the arguments that works well there, of course, is the talent pathway, that, nobody starts off elite. Mara Yamauchi expresses this very well in the film that we all made together recently. And we are finding that it's a matter of stiffening the resolve of these governing bodies to apply the logic, because they know that if they fix it at elite level, they need to fix it at every level. And what's more, most sport is run by amateurs, volunteers. If you go to a football match or a road race or anything, it's all run by volunteers. There's no testosterone suppression. There's no checking. So you need to make it very simple, or else you just won't have that kind of sport. But I think we're winning that argument too. People know it's a bad argument. They just need a bit more courage to push on through and restore fairness at all levels.
It does seem very widely, and people say this right across all the areas in which trans inclusion has encroached on women's rights, that sport is the most obvious and the easiest one, because there's this overarching idea of fairness and because also it's very, very visible. Do you think that there's a read across from sports to other policy issues where we need to say female means female? Or do you fear that we might fix sport and not, for example, fix prisons, rape crisis centres, the places where women are much less visible?
Well, I think there is a read across in how the policies came about, and that can help us fix it, because the policies happened because people forgot to consult both sets of people who were affected by what they thought of as a trans inclusion policy. And, a lot of well-meaning people adopted these policies. Obviously, there were activists telling them what to do, and, all kinds of different motivations at work. But most people, I think, can be made to rethink. And one of the things we found is that when we talk about sport, we're not suggesting anything bad about trans people. It's nothing to do with their motivation. It's nothing to do with the risk they present, nothing like that. So that makes it a slightly safer conversation to have. But it does then extend quite naturally into, well, if you're going to allow self-ID into your tennis club, as the Lawn Tennis Association currently does, what happens when my daughter goes into the changing rooms at the tennis club and there could be a male person in there, and that could be a very nice male person, but she's not expecting that. And she's so mortified, she just turns on her heel and doesn't go back. And they understand that. So you could start to get, into that territory without getting into the kind of accusations that you were calling people predatory or anything like that. So I think it's both how these policies have come about, which is failing to think through the consequences, and then also that sport extends into changing rooms and personal space and privacy and all of that too.
Actually, that's a very good point. Sorry, you go on.
There's one other thing I would say, which is that one of the other issues is what constituency we're advocating for. And, as we know, and I suspect a lot of people listening will know, by and large, even though women are a majority, female people are a majority of the world's population, we're kind of expected to just accommodate other people's needs, right? We're expected to budge up and look after the non-binaries or the, whatever, right? And so it can be quite hard to get people, the EDI people in sports bodies, who are a lot of the people making the decisions, quite hard to get them to think that women actually matter or might have a need that's worth accommodating, whereas they're very concerned with other minorities, including trans people. So when we take a subset of women and we talk about teenage girls, for example, suddenly they actually can empathize a little bit in a way that they don't seem able to empathize with women like you and me. When we talk about religious minorities or ethnic minorities who need to know that a space will be single sex, like, for example, Muslim women needing single sex swimming sessions, again, it's part of their credo as EDI people that's a legitimate requirement. So even people who don't think it's legitimate for me to say, I don't want to share space with a male body because that person's, it's not because they're trans, it's because they're male. They won't take that from me, but they kind of have to take it on behalf of those groups like the ethnic minorities. And so we find that we can make a case. You'd think that the biggest number affected would be the most compelling argument, but actually sometimes a very particular subset works better and can actually engage people.
Interesting. If you could just give us a little pen picture. You and I were both at the Affiliate conference last year, and we had the video link with one of the swimmers, as you know, because you set up the session, who had to change with Riley Gaines. And one of our viewers has said, can you speak a bit to what it must be like to actually have to change in these, quite enclosed and difficult spaces? So perhaps you could tell our audience about what that swimmer testified.
So I asked Riley, we recorded an interview with Riley, which is on our website under that Philly October session. I asked her about the changing rooms and I didn't know. And she explained that those suits they swim in take about 15 minutes to get into because they're not stretchy. The racing suits. So you're there, you're naked, you're wriggling around. There's no chance of like wrapping a towel around yourself and just jumping out of your cozy like you do at the beach. It's a protracted process. And so the fact that there was a 6'4" male, Leah Thomas, in there, they found deeply uncomfortable, and because they're particularly vulnerable in that situation, just in terms of privacy, So yeah, I mean, she gets quite tearful actually when she talks about it, just because it was humiliating. She didn't feel in any danger, obviously, but there's no dignity in that, and you feel, I think, they feel completely disregarded and disrespected.
Yeah. Okay, my last question before we go to our three-way conversation. And when do you think this is actually going to be fixed?
Yeah, we're making really good progress in the UK because the Sports Council Equality Group put out that new guidance. We have UK governing bodies then who are pushing their world federations, and we have world federations led by World Athletics, thank goodness, who are beginning to rethink the whole thing. But there are other countries, America, for example, the United States and Canada and New Zealand, where the entire sports governance kind of, infrastructure is completely on board with self-ID. And getting them to shift is going to be really difficult. And so there's going to be a huge battle between governing bodies from countries like the UK lobbying for world change and the same sport in America lobbying not to change it. So I think it's going to be very messy. I think the big question will be what happens in Paris in the Olympics next year. We thought that when people saw Laurel Hubbard weightlifting in Tokyo, that it would wake people up. And it did wake some people up, but nothing like as much as I would have expected. And actually, Leah Thomas and those poor girls in North America, that probably was more of a wake-up call. So I think after Paris, there will be more sports that are seeing that it's just not fair. And even though some of them may want to defend that as being progressive and wonderful, the thing that in the end seems to work is when they're humiliated in the media. The Leah Thomas effect and the Emily Bridges effect were huge because sports suddenly thought, I don't want to be defending this. It just doesn't look good. It's really hard to defend. So I think Paris will be a critical moment. We also think the World Cup, the Women's World Cup, Football World Cup in Australia this summer could be significant because we know there are male players there. and we think there are going to be male players in the women's teams. So, yeah, I can't say I think this will all be done in a year, Helen, but I think momentum is with us.
Thank you, Fiona. Okay, so let's bring Sharron back in here. Sharron, so much love for you in the comments. So many people saying thank you for what you're doing, actually, to both of you. And sort of several questions centered around, can you talk a bit about like coming out as thinking that women's sports matters and is only for women, and what the experience of that was like, and what the pushback was like, and how you fortified yourself through it?
I don't know that there was ever a moment. I think for me, obviously, when the IOC changed the rules in 2015, that wasn't in time for the Rio Olympic Games because they had to suppress testosterone for 1 year and there wasn't enough time. So we knew it was going to be, the first Olympic Games was going to be Laurel Hubbard in Tokyo. And then that got delayed another year as well because of COVID. So the whole thing was, very strange. We weren't even sure if it was going to happen or no. And like Fiona said, I think what I've been trying to stop is for every sport to have a Leah Thomas moment. And that is what I find extraordinary, that we have 100 years of Olympic Games where we know what men and women do in track, in swimming, in badminton, you name it, every single sport, we know the difference. Why do we have to have a Leah Thomas to know the obvious in every single sport? That's what I was like, why are we having to throw a number of women under the bus to prove the bloody obvious? And that's what I just could not get my head around. We were having this live experiment again, and it was women that were going to lose out. So I just thought, I just can't stand by and watch this happen. So we wrote this letter to the IOC, just begging them to please do the science first before you change the rules. And they just ignored it. I mean, they literally just ignored it. And the research that they used from Joanna Harper is just shocking. I mean, there is no other word for it than absolutely abysmal. I mean, it was using self-reported times over a period of 20 years sometimes in a totally non-competitive environment. And where they went, guess what? We've got slower after 20 years. Well, guess what? I'm slower now than when I won my. I mean, how ridiculous is that? And the one person who hadn't got slower because they bothered to train, she dropped from the program, she dropped from the study and said it was an outlier.
So why aren't we able to get more people?
Because obviously you have injury, you have so many factors that are going to affect that, but none of those things were taken into account. And as you heard Fiona mention, not a single female athlete was asked her opinion until last year.
How do we get more athletes to speak out, and in particular more men to speak out? Like Daley Thompson, bless him, is an outlier on this. We need hundreds of thousands of men to start speaking out on this.
I know. I am very disappointed with men. I think they think it's not their problem. The ridiculous thing is that these are males. And most of these men, if they don't have daughters already, will have daughters and wives and girlfriends and mums. I just don't understand when they know damn well what happens in sport. If you speak to them privately, they're very, very much on side. And if you do any private polling, they're very much on side. And this is what a lot of the sporting bodies have been trying to avoid. It's actually polling their members because they know absolutely categorically that you'll have 80, 90, almost 100% saying to you, no, we want fair sport. So they've avoided doing that, for obvious reasons. And it was only when Emily Bridges was going to cycle that the girls got together behind the scenes. And it's very hard to try to get the girls to come together because they're being threatened with their sponsorship. They're being threatened with their part on the team. I mean, I've had coaches in tears to me saying that they're walking away from their jobs because of the unjust situation that they're in. They feel like they're between a rock and a hard place. I have almost daily conversations, slightly less now, actually. I have to say it is getting better, which is really good news. And it's really good news that people are feeling more confident that they can begin to say a few things. It takes someone like Amelia, to come out as an athlete, as a shot putter and say, right, and then that gives them courage because they're strengthening numbers. But we still just can't seem to get the girls to band together the same way that the men would band together, because this would never happen in men's sport. So if you look back and think about Oscar Pistorius when he wanted to run in the Olympics with his blades, that didn't happen because the men thought they might get beaten. And then we had the shoes, that got sorted out within a season. Then we had the shark fin suits, that got sorted out within a season because Michael Phelps said he won't be racing unless they sort it out. They sorted it out. So when it affects men's sport, it gets sorted out extremely quickly. It's only when it affects women's sport that it goes on for years. And I don't for the love of me understand why some of the girls just don't come together. Because if they all came together and just went, we're not going to race, this would be sorted out very quickly.
Well, so that's an interesting question, because that is one of the things that one of our audience members asked about, which is the possibility of a boycott, either by audience or by women. So maybe I could ask both of you that. So Sharon, we'll start with you and then I'll turn to Fiona.
Well, they are made to sign a contract. So that's part of the big problem. So that contract says that they have all sorts of things that they can and can't do, things that they can and can't say. They're not allowed to really have political opinions, and this is classed as a political opinion. Then, of course, they have their personal sponsors, who are all trying to be PC as well. So you can imagine if someone's got a contract in track and field with Nike, you know what Nike are going to say if you come out and say that, you know, you believe in fair sport. And these girls don't have a great deal of money. They have enough money to literally pay their way, you know, so that they can do their sport. And so they're being blackmailed into being quiet. And when their governing body then doesn't stand up for them by coming to them secretly or privately, or, you know, via email and saying, right, we need to talk to you all and we need to poll you all, and then you can be en masse and we can just fall back on the fact that we've asked you all and this is how you all feel. That's why I thought there was a big out for the governing bodies. They could, you know, because we know that the athletes, if you ask the guys and the girls, very, very strongly, they will come out in favour of fair sport.
So can I bring you in, Fiona, on that? Do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of chief execs of governing bodies have said to me, well, we know, so if I can think of one combat sport, for example, where the chief exec said to me, well, people don't want to watch a man beating up a woman. And of course, again, whilst that's nice to know, you know, it shouldn't come to that. But we know, that's why there's a dilemma around, we really don't want to see women being harmed, either physically hurt or their career in sport being damaged. But we also know that when people see blatant unfairness on the pitch or on the court or on the track, that it's not popular with the audience. And that commercial consequence is perhaps going to be more influential than our kind of, or at least as important as our lobbying. So, you know, why do the IOC keep on with this? Well, the view is it's because their big American sponsors, Procter & Gamble and McDonald's and people like that, love it. And so unless audiences start to say, I don't like this, you know, that's not a fair race, that this isn't entertaining because what's the point? It's obvious that he has an advantage. Then the sponsors won't change their mind. And so the IOC won't change their mind. Here, closer to home, we have more opportunity, because when parents start saying, you know, it's not right, we're not playing anymore, my daughter won't play or whatever, people running governing bodies here in the UK, they don't have that much money. They do care about their sport. They do want to do the right thing. They're a bit more amenable. But yeah, we'll see.
Something that worries me about what you've just said is that it's women's sports that audiences may turn away from. And I mean, we've only just started to really get any sort of parity of esteem on women's sports. I mean, maybe we could bring Sharon in on that one, because you've battled for any sort of parity of esteem all through your career.
Yeah. Well, we don't have parity. You know, we really don't. I mean, there's 1,000 women in this country that earn their living from sport. There's 11,000 men. American TV prime time gives 4% of the airtime to women, and 1% of the sponsorship dollar goes to female athletes in America. We have nowhere near parity. You know, absolutely, we have this tiny, tiny piece of the cake, and we're expected to move over inside this tiny piece of the cake. And that is the thing which is just utterly ridiculous. We already have nowhere near the same opportunities that a male has in sport to be successful. So it's yeah, it just enrages me, as you all know. You know, and we've fought so hard, and we have made progress in things like football and rugby and cricket, I would say. But in some ways, we've made progress at the detriment of other sports. So if I was to go onto the high street now and ask any, you know, member of the general public, please name me the most successful female swimmer, I think most of them would have a real problem to tell me who it was. And yet that is a swimmer that won 6 medals at the European Championships last year. And we have, you know, 2 females that are Olympic gold medalists. Most people would have no idea. And so that we used to have much more sport variation on the television, and we're losing that. You know, what's happening in women's sport now is what's happened in men's sport, is that we have the big team sports are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and all the other sports are kind of fading into the background. And for swimming in particular, I find that very frustrating, because it's a tough sport and it's close to my heart. But B, it's a massive participation sport, and it's a sport that everyone can do from cradle to grave. And if we don't see it, we don't do it. And we lost 300 pools during COVID, which at the moment are very, you know, looking very unlikely we're going to replace them. And it's really important. It's important that we have elite sport, but it's important also that we have recreational sport, that people, want to be doing things which help them to be fit and healthy, because we have a National Health Service which is buckling under the weight of a very unhealthy society. So these are lots of very important messages which don't affect just elite people, they affect everybody.
On that point, Fiona, I want to bring you in because several of the audience members have referenced parkrun specifically, which has decided to let people identify, I think, as whichever sex they like for their times. And this is driving people absolutely insane. And the question that people are asking is, what can we do?
I have to give a slightly diplomatic answer, and that is that for us as Fair Play for Women, we keep our conversations with governing bodies and with sports confidential, because that way they can trust that they can have an honest conversation with us, they can explore the issues, and we can try and solve them. And yes, we're, that's one of the ones. Yes. So we're working on lots of things, and, we aren't always able to talk about it. We usually, in fact, can't talk about it. There are a couple of things people can do. One thing that I think is really important, if they feel able, is to share their feelings, because if we don't tell anyone, how can anyone know? On parkrun in particular, I do a parkrun every weekend. It's a fantastically inclusive event. I happen to think they've got it a bit wrong, because they've confused inclusion on the day and making everybody welcome with data and records and results, which are absolutely a part of the parkrun experience. And we all look up, where did I come and what percentage did I get and all that. So I think that's a tough nut to crack. But in general, people, if that's how they feel, they should email Parkrun head office and say, you're taking records away from women. And I don't think that's in the spirit of Parkrun. If Parkrun's for everyone, it's for competitive women just as much as it's for trans-identifying males. The other thing they can do, and this is a personal request, is tell us your stories, because it's really powerful when we can go to any particular sport and say, I've heard from women in your sport and this is what they're telling me. Or I've heard from parents or coaches or parents of boys, it doesn't matter who they are. And it really strengthens our case, because, we, as Sharon said, we don't want to wait for the Leah Thomas effect in every sport. We're saying to sports now, the big participation sports have fixed it, right? Swimming, cycling, athletics, they fixed it. So you're going to get trans refugees, you're going to get trans-identifying young people, particularly young people, coming into your sport. And if you tell them that they can come in when they're 12 or when they're 14, because, hey, it's only grassroots, what happens when they are 16 or 18 and you're going to tell them they now have to stop? That's clearly not fair. So you have to be consistent all the way through, and you have to plan for fairness long term. And so that would be my advice, is tell someone and tell us.
Brilliant.
Please.
Thank you. Now, Sharon, I think you want to come in on the parkrun and on feedback as well, maybe.
Yeah, I don't have to be as diplomatic as Fiona does, do I? So that's quite good. I'm good at not being diplomatic and just saying what I think. I think I echo what Fiona said. In fact, tell people, email. What I don't understand with the parkrun is, why are they enabling people just to self-ID online when it would be so easy to add some categories? What's wrong with having a transgender woman record and a transgender men record for this particular course? That's what I just cannot, for the love of me, understand that. Why is it okay to say that someone can ID and have the women's record and just make the women's record so pointless? It's so easy to add extra categories. So maybe when you are emailing Parkrun, just make that suggestion. Just say, look, it's unfair that females are losing their records. We love the inclusivity. We have no problem running on the day with absolutely everybody, because I'm, as Fiona is, I'm a big believer in sport for everybody, but records should be for people that fit that biological category. So let's create some extra categories, and then they can have their own records. But we're all actually racing together or running together or whatever. How hard is that? When it's an online process anyway, it's just adding 2 boxes or 3 boxes if you want to have a non-binary one as well, and just create some more records, because this is a fun environment. It is people doing it to help themselves keep fit. But there is an element of competition, because everybody wants to try and improve. And otherwise, if there's not an element of competition, why do they have records at all? Why don't you just do away with the records if they're not competitive? Well, that's a lie, because they are competitive. That's why they have them. So yeah, ad boxes, make that suggestion and we just keep pushing it and pushing it. And if enough of us push it, then eventually they'll do it.
Brilliant. Fiona, we're coming fairly near the end, but I think you want to come in on that. But I also want to ask you about prepubescent, because that's another of the dividing lines that we're seeing as sports people try to get to the point that they give some of our rights back to us. Right.
Yeah,
what did you want to say on parkrun?
Well, I wanted to say that this movement now is an international movement. So, we're working here in the UK together, Sharon, Emma, Mara, Kathy, Divine, lots of people. But we are also connected with similar groups all over the world. And we have been for some time now. And so that really helps because we can collectively use the networks of Olympians and elite sports people, as well as others, to try and find our way to where we can influence world federations. So even if we don't know anyone in a particular world federation, through our network, we can find someone who does. So, we are getting a lot of movement. And of course, you will know they're all looking to us in the UK because we're leading the way. So, it's a nice place to be. On the children one, I think there are a couple of things going on. We have argued about male puberty being a critical turning point because it's so unarguable. But it's not because we think below that doesn't matter. It's because it's been so damned hard to get any progress at all up until this point. And so you take what you get and then you bank that and then you push for more. What's happening in schools now, and we're now doing some work on that, looking at mixed sport in schools in particular, doesn't tend to happen in sports clubs, community sports clubs, because they're run by sports people. It happens in schools because so much of the activities run by teachers who are not full-time PE people, and they're very much, it's just an extension of the school philosophy of, let's be kind and include everyone. So partly the school's guidance that will come from the Department of Education might help. Partly it will cascade back to schools from governing bodies when we change them. But also it is an area we're looking at because we know that little girls are put off sport if they can't win. And we know that there are differences in primary schools. So that will continue to be a battleground, I think.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. And I'm going to finish up by bringing Sharon back and asking her a question from one of our audience members. You have a book launch coming up in London, and actually our very own Emma Hilton is speaking at that too. Have you any in-person events outside London for people who can't make it to London? Where can people meet you and get you to sign their book?
Oh, on the high street shopping in Bath, probably. I mean, at the moment, we haven't got too many plans. Obviously, the event, as you said, down in London, and then we're just going to kind of wait and see what happens with the book, and what we can actually do. But yes, I would like to try to, but any events that someone hears that I'm at, if you've got a book, bring it along. Thank you so much for everyone who's buying the book as well. That's, I want it to be a reference book. I want you to be able to use it to arm you with all the information, so that it's actually there in one place. And thank you everyone for all the support, because there are days when it can be a bit tough, without a shadow of a doubt. There are some extremely horrible people out there, usually men that sit alone at home with nothing else better to do but try to beat women over the head. And unfortunately, they've been given a club to do this. So, they're not the sports people. They're just very angry, nasty men that don't like women. And they've been given this instrument to be able to, a blunt instrument to be able to kind of beat women up. And I get that, as lots of other people do, on a regular basis. So every time someone sends me a nice message, it really helps. So I thank you all hugely for that.
Well, lots of love from everyone on this webinar to you, Sharon. And I reiterate that this is the book that I think is going to be the easiest to give to people who are sceptical about how this affects people, because it is so evidence-based, and because Sharon is, of course, a national treasure, and also because she can compare it with the historical experience of racing against East Germans. And so she has the life history that gives her the right to speak about this. But also to Fiona and to Nick Williams at Fair Play for Women, the work they have done behind the scenes and in front of the scenes in the past 5 years has been just a model of activism, just the way that they manage. I've seen them do it, the way that they speak to regulators across all of these sports, so calm, so consistent, so logical, so fair, so professional in the way that they, guarantee anonymity and confidentiality. And a lot of the movement that we have seen in the past couple of years has really been down to them. And so on that note, I will thank both my speakers, and I'll just say a few words about what Sex Matters does before we close for the evening. Thank you both again so much. Well, so Sex Matters, what we do is campaign for clarity on sex in law, policy and everyday life. And that's not just sport, but we've heard about one of the clearest ways in which not protecting the definition of sex in law and in everyday life affects women. You can support us by signing up and you get our weekly memo. You can pay £5 a month or more and help us to do the work we do. We work, of course, with all these other wonderful groups like Fair Play for Women very closely. And we can send you some merch, some nice mugs and so on. And with that, it's good evening from me, and I cannot recommend Sharon's book highly enough. Do go out and get yourself a copy, and I can tell you that if you ever see her and ask her to sign it, she'll be really happy. People do like signing the book that they've written because it's a year's work, as she said, and you're proud of it. It's like your baby. Well, have a very good evening to everybody, and thank you all very, very much.